Hello, my name is Dr. Tamara Scully. I'm a clinical psychologist. I work in the Psychology in Schools team based in Suffolk. And today we're going to be talking about supporting our most vulnerable students on their return to school in September. This presentation has been adapted from an excellent presentation given by Mary Meredith, who is the Inclusion Officer for Lincolnshire County Council. So what we're hoping to achieve from this webinar today is to raise your awareness of what adverse childhood experiences are and to think about the impact that these experiences have on our children and young people. I also would love you to leave with a better understanding of how we can all support these vulnerable young people regardless of our role within the school environment. And finally, to recognise the fundamental importance of looking after our own well-being first. So we're going to just start by thinking about what are adverse childhood experiences. So this term came from a very big public survey that was carried out in America in the 1990s. So the researchers asked over 1,600 Americans to think back on their childhoods, and they were asked 10 questions. So 5 of these questions related to adverse experiences that might have happened around them. So for example, if a family member had gone to prison or if they had experienced a very fractious divorce. And the other 5 questions were related to abuse directed at them. So if they had experienced physical, emotional, sexual abuse. So if the answer to any of the 10 questions was yes, this was an ACE score. So anyone can have an ACE score between 0 and 10. And what was found in this survey, in the analysis of this survey, was this really strong correlation between a high ACE score and significant mental and physical health difficulties. So I guess what that means is that the more times you answer yes to these 10 questions, the more difficulties you were experiencing with both your physical and your mental health. And you know, the impact of adverse childhood experiences is now really well documented. So what this slide refers to predominantly are those individuals who have 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. And for those people, it's been really clearly identified that they are much more likely to have a whole host of physical health difficulties like lung disease and liver disease. They're also much more likely to develop heart disease. And in addition to that, they're also more likely to have mental health difficulties. So as you can see from this slide, they're much more likely to attempt to take their own lives. They're 4.5 times more likely to develop significant depression. And I mean, the level of drug abuse among this population is also much higher compared to people without any ACEs. So these adverse childhood experiences are very much being recognised as a public health concern, and I think it's really important that within a school environment we're just mindful of those children who we know have had some of these experiences, because I think it will really help us to kind of understand some of the difficulties that they're experiencing. So if we just take a second just to think about the ACEs in the UK before the pandemic. So what we know from the research is that around half of all adults living in England have experienced at least one form of adversity in their childhood or adolescence. And I think that's just a really useful piece of information to be able to hold on to, because in essence, I guess what that means is that we're all working alongside people who have experienced at least one form of adversity in their childhood. And then in terms of children and young people, like it's really sad, I think, to recognise that actually just over half of our young people have experienced no adverse childhood experiences, and as many as 9% have experienced more than 4. And I guess if we think about this in the context of the average classroom, you'll have at least 3 children who are in this position. And I suppose what this has also raised is kind of some very significant concerns around the secondary risks associated with the pandemic. So I know that we've all kind of been talking about the risk to our physical health, and those risks are really scary and they're really legitimate. But I guess what we also need to think about are those secondary risks that might be bearing down on our children and young people, particularly when we're in kind of quite restricted lockdown conditions. And, you know, I guess in this context, it's important that we just think about what has been happening through the lockdown period. We know that there's been an increase in domestic violence. We know that children are making many more phone calls to various charities across the country because they're struggling to deal with parents abusing alcohol. I'm sure all of you know at least one person who is now unemployed since the start of the pandemic, and we know that nationally poverty is on the increase. And we also know that there is a significant increase in the number of families filing for divorce. And I suppose what this tells us is that there are many children who are going to be coming back to school having experienced a much greater level of stress at home, and this is going to have a really significant impact on their ability to cope in school. So, you know, I guess what we know is when your fight or flight response is activated on a continual basis, this has a fairly big impact on the brain. In addition to the fact that our base rates of cortisol are much higher, and for many of these children, if you took their pulse rates, you can feel a higher pulse rate. So it's just holding on to the fact that just because they move into the relative safety of school, this doesn't mean that everything changes. It doesn't, because for many of these children, they're going to remain in this very hypervigilant state. In Mary Meredith's presentation, she talked about a really useful metaphor developed by a psychologist called Karen Thraisman. And what she talked about was this idea of these children living in shark-infested waters. So if you live in a high ACE environment, it's a little bit like being surrounded by sharks. It's like not knowing what a shadow beneath the water might represent, or what still waters might mean. And I suppose what this essentially creates is a constant state of hypervigilance, being unable to relax as a result of that, and presenting in school sometimes as volatile, or maybe really jumpy, or really activated, and so on. So having had these experiences during lockdown will really impact these young people as they come back into the school environment. So I guess just holding all of that information in mind, I suppose what we want to start thinking about is, how can we kind of support these young people? And thankfully, there are a number of protective factors. And one of these factors, probably the most important, is what Dr. Bruce Perry calls social buffering. And essentially, what this means is if children have enough access to high quality attuned relationships, this really reduces the impact of having a high ACE score. And actually what the research is showing is that high quality relationships in childhood and outcomes in later life are even more strongly correlated than high ACEs and poor outcomes. So essentially what this means is that relationships are everything. But the problem for many of these children is relational poverty. And what that means is that they don't have access to many people with whom they can have an attuned, nurturing, safe relationship. And sometimes school can be an antidote to this. So many children who do okay, despite having many high ACEs, are often those children who have had good experiences of school relationships. And actually what happens is school becomes the buffer and it really increases their sense of belonging. And I guess it's just recognizing that buffering is a really good route to resilience. And I guess in terms of school practice, it's important to spend time just thinking about how you can put this into place. So, we know that a key adult is of fundamental importance for the young person within the school environment. And what's really useful to know is this can be anybody. Anybody can be a key adult to a young person. It can be a receptionist, it can be a caretaker, it can be a form teacher, it can be a member of the senior leadership team. But I guess what we need to do in order to identify those key adults is we need to listen to the voice of the child and we need to think about who their key adult could be. And importantly, I guess, is just remembering that it's not about being a therapist. It's about being human. It's about being a kind person and being able to listen and offer the attunement that that child might be lacking in their own life outside of school. So within this context of buffering relationships, Bruce Perry also talks about the concept of therapeutic dosing. And I guess what he's emphasizing is that it's those small interactions that are the most powerful, especially if they're repeated over time for these young people. So I guess an example of this might be giving that young person a warm welcome each morning when they come into school, or consistently checking in, just having a really quick check-in about how their day has gone. Because what this does is it starts to build trust and it starts to help the young person to understand that they can have a safe relationship with other adults. And Karen Threisman has coined a really simple phrase to kind of capture this idea. So what she says is every interaction is an intervention. And I guess what that means is that we all have an opportunity every time we interact with a student. We have an opportunity to give them a positive experience of that interaction and through that process kind of build up their trust in adults and in the idea that actually you can have a safe relationship with other adults. But I guess what we need B is a little bit strategic about relationships. So, you know, we're all human, and some children are going to be so much easier to engage than other children. You know, the children who are good at communicating, they tend to be the children that kind of draw us in. But actually, it's probably the children and young people who are the most difficult to engage, that need our engagement the most. So what we need to do, I guess, is to identify the young people who are vulnerable and actually rebuff us or withdraw from us, because we know that these are probably the children that need that attuned relationship the most. And, you know, for these children, I think kind of how they're greeted when they come into the classroom can be incredibly important, because again, over time, this will make a difference. And I know that this can feel kind of counterintuitive because of their lack of response or their belligerent response. But I guess it's just about recognizing that this is something that's going to be helpful for them. And it's about everyone, I think, kind of stepping up and essentially kind of using yourself as a resource in order to support these young people. And the other thing that I've just included on this slide, because I just thought it was a really helpful thing to think about, is this idea of extracurricular activities. So what we know about extracurricular activities is that they are a huge source of relational wealth. And, you know, the reason why there's such a huge source of relational wealth is that we tend to interact with children in a different way. It tends to be more informal, there tends to be a bit more laughter, a bit more banter, and because of that, there's more bonding. But actually, sadly, our most marginalised and disadvantaged children are the most unlikely to be involved in these activities. Now, I know at the moment that many of these activities are not going to be available, but I guess it just might be helpful for schools to hold in mind how valuable reinstating some of this might be for our more vulnerable students, just as something to hold on to when things maybe get relaxed a little bit more and we're allowed think about the reintroduction of these activities. And I just wanted to touch on the difference between shame and guilt. So we know that children need to be contained and everybody needs to be safe. So, you know, boundary setting is absolutely essential within a school environment. But I guess there's a way of doing it, and particularly for children with high ACEs, we just need to ensure that we're trying our very best to maintain a relational approach. And, you know, boundary setting is always difficult. None of us like to be told off, even when we're grown up. But when we make the boundary about the behaviour and not the person, what we're inducing is guilt as opposed to shame. And guilt and shame are two entirely different things. So when we feel shame, we tend to locate all of the difficulties in ourselves, and generally it makes us want to move away from other people. It kind of makes us want to hide. Whereas guilt is a much more pro-social emotion. So what guilt does is it drives us towards others, and we want to make right what has gone wrong. So we want to say sorry, and guilt makes us much more inclined to this way. And I think, you know, I think just a very helpful basic way of thinking about this is, you know, guilt is when we experience guilt, our cognitive processes is something around I did something bad. and psychologists would call this a pro-social emotion, whereas shame is much more about I am something bad, and it's much more of an anti-social emotion because it tends to kind of pull us away from people. And you know, for any of us, a boundary that involves shaming is really painful, and actually it will often result in a lot of defensiveness and the boundary not being accepted. But this is particularly relevant for those children who struggle with relational poverty and have high ACE scores. So often the children with high ACE scores are already steeped in shame. So it's incredibly important that we are mindful in how we approach boundary setting. And just try and ensure that what we're inducing is guilt and not shame. Because essentially what happens when children are exposed repeatedly to shame is they develop a shield against shame. So this is something that was developed by Kim Golding and Dan Hughes. And what their research suggests is that children and young people develop a shield against shame because of the fact that shame is so painful. And you know, you're going to recognize this, you know the scenario. Something has happened, you have eyewitnesses, you have CCTV footage, and sometimes a child still won't admit that they did the thing. And this can be extremely frustrating unless you're able to understand this. Because essentially the shield of shame this is how vulnerable children protect themselves. And generally children will take one of four positions. So they might deny it and say, I never did anything. They might blame whoever's around them. So they'll say, it wasn't me, it was his fault. They might minimize what they've done, or they might get really dysregulated and really start raging. And when they're in that state, they're really difficult to reach. And I'm guessing that if you took a moment to think about your most vulnerable or tricky students and asked yourself the question, does this shame shield fit for them? I'm guessing that probably the answer might be yes, at least for some of those students. So what we're going to start thinking about now is how do we start to connect and interact with these hard to reach vulnerable young people. And the theory that we're going to spend the next few slides thinking about is called connection before correction. So this is a model that was developed by Kim Golding, who is a very renowned researcher in attachment theory. And what she originally called the model was two hands of parenting. So I've just changed that to two hands of discipline. But it applies in a very similar way. And essentially what this theory means is that we need two hands to hold our vulnerable children, and all children really. So there must be a hand that provides structure and supervision and boundaries. And this hand needs to be consistent and steady. But if we don't invest equally in the other hand that invests in warmth and care and nurture, then ultimately we are not going to be meeting the needs of our most vulnerable children, because we need to connect with these children and young people before we move to the correction phase. And what we're going to think about now is just kind of set the 7 steps that Kim Golding kind of recommends for working through this process with our young people. So the first one is fairly obvious. It's noticing. So it's just using the knowledge that school might be more difficult for children and young people with a high ACE score, and just paying attention to changes in their behaviour and recognising when they might be struggling with their environment. So they might be struggling with complying with requests in class, or they might be struggling with the unstructured time of break and lunch, when there's a lot of noise and a lot of stimulation around them. And then the second step is a really important step. So it's just asking the question, am I regulated? Will I be able to stay open and engaged with this young person? And this is really important, because what we know is that children are going to be looking to us to read the emotional temperature in the room. And this can be really positive if we're able to remain calm in the face of their difficulties. But actually it can also be incredibly challenging, because if we ourselves are even slightly dysregulated, we can really dysregulate a child who is intensely focused on our emotions. And I guess what we need to remember is that vulnerable young people are much more hypervigilant to emotional states. So what we know is they're going to have their antenna up, and they're going to be really tuned into the environment around them, because this is probably what they had to do at home in order to manage some of those adverse experiences. And sometimes it may be that we need someone else to take over, and that's okay. It really is so much more important to recognize that we're becoming unregulated and allow ourselves time to calm down, like to kind of calm our own hyperarousal. And sometimes to be able to do that, you need to be able to walk away, because ultimately we can only regulate another person well when we're taking care of our own well-being and we're ensuring that our own bucket is full. And I just wanted to take a minute just to think about this and to really emphasize the massive importance of looking after ourselves first. There's an educational writer called James Cohen, and he uses a really lovely analogy about how humans are the cheetahs of emotional regulation. So a cheetah can run really fast, but not indefinitely. And similarly, we're all able to cope with stress for a period of time, but then our reserves get depleted. And when our ability to regulate our own emotions become exhausted, it's so important that we take time to replenish our own resource. And this doesn't need to be complicated. It's just making sure that you're taking time out to talk to someone in your family, or you're talking to a friend or a colleague. And this can just allow you to get maybe some much needed empathy for yourself. And we all recognize that support networks in school are vital, because what they allow is protected time to debrief after a tough day. And also, I guess, just creating regular opportunities for relaxation and self-care, and making sure that you're having time to fill up your own resource bucket. The Psychology in Schools team actually have created a webinar specifically thinking about staff well-being. And I would really recommend, if you have time, just to have a look at that, because it will give you some lovely ideas about how you can fill up your own bucket, and some small and uncomplicated things that you can kind of do throughout the day to make sure that you're looking after yourself. Because, you know, the bottom line is, if you are a dysregulated adult, you are not going to be able to regulate the young person in your care. So top of our list always needs to be our self-care and looking after ourselves. So the next step in Kim Golding's model of connection before correction is asking this question: is the young person regulated? And it's incredibly important that you think about where the young person is. You know, are they in the green zone where their brain is integrated and they have access to kind of the thinking part of their brain, the prefrontal cortex, so that they're able to reason with us? Or actually, do they need time before they're going to be able to reason and compromise with us? Now, of course, we're never going to leave a highly dysregulated child to regulate on their own. But I guess this is where strategies like grounding and the 4 square breathing can be really useful. But probably, as you all know, it's really hard to do any of those techniques in that moment of dysregulation. So I guess what's helpful is to have this planned in advance with the young person so that you have a strategy that they're familiar with. And, you know, again, these strategies don't need to be complicated. It might be just recognizing for the young person that you're responsible for that. You know that if they're able to physically move their body by going for a walk, that really helps them to regulate. Or they might be able to regulate by doing kind of some deep breathing exercises that they've had a chance to practice when they've been in a more regulated state. And I guess if it's possible, and I know this won't always be possible, but it's really beneficial if they're able to co-regulate with an adult that they trust in school. Because, you know, I guess the point to take away from this slide really is that you cannot move forward with any conversation or planning until the young person is more regulated. And to try and do so will probably just lead you into a higher level of frustration, and it might further dysregulate the young person. So the next step is being curious. And I guess just linking this to the previous slide, the timing of this step is everything. So sometimes the young person is going to be just too unregulated to be able to tolerate this. But once they are a little bit more regulated, and we are able to pick this up, I guess what we need to do is we need to get round that shield of shame. And one way that we can do this is by showing curiosity and understanding. And it's you know, the essence of this, I guess, is for us to focus on getting curious instead of getting furious. And this can be really hard. And there's Louise Bomber, who's a mental health worker, promotes a really lovely technique around this called wondering aloud. And essentially what this involves is us saying out loud what the child might be feeling based on what we've observed. And this is, you know, often when I talk to staff about this, they will often say, but you know, sometimes we have no idea why the young person is behaving in a particular way. But I guess what curiosity does is it gives the child an invitation to talk about it, and it validates the thoughts and the feelings underneath the behavior. So in those situations where you really are struggling to understand why the young person is behaving like that, you might say something like, you know, I'm a little bit confused. Usually you love going to PE, but today you don't seem to want to take part. I'm wondering what's different about today. Maybe it's confusing for you too, and that's okay. And what this will do, even though you don't know what's wrong with the young person, but what you create is a moment of connection. And what the young person is experiencing is an adult really trying to understand him. And you know, what happens is that over time, this will begin to build trust and confidence in this relationship. And you know, sometimes you will wonder aloud and you'll think you have a good idea of what's wrong with the young person, and you're going to get it wrong. And I guess when this happens, it is just about holding up our hands and just admitting it and saying, hey, I got it totally wrong. You know, thank you for helping me to understand what you were really feeling. And for the young person, just having repeated experiences of someone trying to understand them is just very powerful in terms of building up their trust and their confidence in the school environment. The fifth step is acceptance and empathy. And Mary Meredith in her presentation calls the empathy step a superpower step, because ultimately what empathy does for all of us is it promotes connection. And what empathy is essentially is it's an active, I guess, very genuine desire to understand the emotion that the young person is experiencing and to validate that emotion without judging. Because what this allows is it allows the young person to feel acknowledged and valued. And I guess through this process, it opens the door for the young person to be able to compromise and negotiate and begin to problem solve. So empathy is really powerful if you think back to the Lego blocks that were on the previous slide. Empathy is really powerful in moving the young person out of the red zone back into the green zone. And when they're in the green zone, they have much more access to the thinking part of their brain, which really helps them then with compromise and negotiation and all of those kind of executive functioning skills. And, you know, I guess it might sound something like this. So, you know, it must be really hard for you to try and sit in class today when you're already feeling so full up. We all only have so much resource, and I can get why this class was really difficult on top of everything else. And it's, you know, a lot of people, when we, as psychologists, we talk through these ideas of connecting before correcting, people get kind of a little bit anxious about, you know, but we need to kind of hold the boundaries. It's not okay for them not to do something. And I guess that's an important message, because it's not about condoning inappropriate behaviour. And it's not about saying, okay, it's okay for you not to do the work in class today. But I guess what it is about is it's showing the young person that we are trying to understand. And, you know, when we feel the feelings of another person and we put ourselves into their shoes, I guess what that allows is it allows that young person to feel seen and to feel understood. And I suppose the only other thing to kind of mention about this is sometimes the young person can initially kind of really struggle to accept the empathic response because it might not be something that they've ever experienced before. And I suppose this is where it can be really helpful to hold in mind that notion that we were talking about earlier of therapeutic dosing, and recognizing that this is a marathon, it's not a sprint. And actually those small empathic encounters on a day-to-day basis is what is going to build the relationship. And ultimately what that will lead to is positive, trusting relationships for the most vulnerable students within the school. The sixth point is boundaries. And we all recognize that boundaries are incredibly important, not just to manage the running of large secondary schools, but also because boundaries are incredibly containing. They give us a real sense, young people and adults alike, they give us a real sense of safety. And ultimately, it's a life skill. All of us need to be able to tolerate boundaries. So this approach is certainly not about not holding those boundaries, but because you have taken the time to connect with the young person by using the previous steps, it is now so much easier to put the boundary into place, because ultimately what you're doing is you're making the moment a much more teachable moment, because the young person is regulated and they're able to attend to what you're saying. So there is a clear recognition that young people really need boundaries, and we know we need to set them, but I guess you can't go straight to this stage with these vulnerable children, because what this will trigger is their shame shield, and then it becomes so much more difficult to implement that boundary without really damaging your relationship with them. And then the final step in Kim Golding's model is repair the relationship. And I think this is a really important step. I mean, all of us know that in all of our close relationships, we have ruptures. It's normal to have ruptures in relationships. But I guess what's really important for all young people is that they're shown that relationships can be repaired. So a rupture can happen, but then the relationship can be repaired. And often for children with high ACE scores who experience a lot of relational poverty, they might have very little experience of this repair in relationships. And I guess it's just asking yourself that question after you've had a rupture in your relationship with a young person. Do I need to repair the relationship with this young person so that they know what's happened is not going to affect our relationship? And, it might just be saying something as simple as, we're good. I'm not bothered about this anymore. I'm looking forward to seeing you tomorrow. Because ultimately, you may not like a lot of their behavior or a lot of the decisions that they make, but you can still like the young person. And repairing the relationship with that young person after a rupture is really sending them that clear message. And then the final thing I just wanted to mention is this idea of being playful. Young people need play and fun. It's incredibly useful in building relationships. And I think it's one of the reasons why children gain so much relational wealth from the extracurricular activities, because there is much more playfulness, there's much more banter, there's much more humor being used. And now, kind of having worked in schools for a year, I can see that schools are incredibly good at using humor and banter with their young people. And I guess I just included it just to give us all a reminder that actually it's a hugely helpful way to help children to regulate. So when children are kind of using banter or they're giggling, it's a really good sign, because it means that their brain is integrated and they're in a place where they're able to listen and they're able to learn. So I really hope that you found that helpful. If you would like some further information on trauma-informed practice, Young Minds have some excellent resources. Their website is youngminds.org.uk. Or alternatively, you can always contact the Psychology in Schools team if you'd like some more information or if you'd like some further training around this. Okay, thank you so much. Bye bye.